Okay, welcome all to this evening with Arundhathi Subramaniam. May I ask you all to put your phones on silent if you haven't already. As you all know, Arundhathi is a poet, and she's published 4 volumes of poetry, and the latest one is When God is a Traveler. I read the book from cover to cover, and I realized that was not a very wise thing to do, because I really had to go back to it again and read, in particular, the 8 poems that make up the Shakuntala cycle again, more alertly and slowly. But if you want to follow my example, there are copies you can pick up from outside, and the author would be quite happy to autograph them later. I guess some of you have already picked them up. Arundhathi is also the editor of 3 volumes of poetry. One's called Eating God, a Book of Bhakti Poetry. Another one is Another Country, Sahitya Akademi anthology on contemporary Indian poetry in English, and Confronting Love, a co-edited Penguin anthology of love poems. She also published a book called Pilgrim's India, which is a book on sacred journeys for Penguin. And she's also published a book on a contemporary mystic, Sadhguru, More Than a Life, again for Penguin, and the Book of the Buddha. You will notice when you watch Arundhathi that you watch her gestures, her hands and fingers and her arms, the way they move. You'll, I think, come to realize that she has a background in dance. And yes, she's been a dance programmer. She's writes on dance and the performing arts in general, on literature, has done so as a freelancer for the last 25 years. You'll also notice that on this table there are 2 glasses, 2 bottles, 2 mics, and 1 chair. Well, the 2 bottles, the 2 mics, and the 2 glasses are a red herring. Actually, Arundhathi is going to do this entirely solo. She's going to read from a recent volume and from her earlier poems and engage you in a discussion on why poems matter. So, Arundhathi, will you please come to the stage? Thank you.
You have missed one, which is collaborating with Valli also. One of the best collaborations, I would say.
Were you there for the show?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, before we start, before Arundhathi starts, we're going to have a formal release of the book. And I'm going to ask Mr. Gopal Gandhi to please come up and do the honors.
I don't think I should be in the picture.
You should
not be in the picture.
Opening the other book.
No, I think I should. What should I do? I should hand it over or receive it?
I think we should hand it over.
Thank you. Thank you. Do I should? I think you should. Okay.
No.
Oh, I see. The photo.
Thank you.
In a kind of weak moment, I agreed to go solo this evening. I'm not sure I regret it yet, but can I just say one thing? The one thing I would particularly request you all to do is to participate as much as possible and make this easier on me. I'll get through, I'm most myself when I read poems, so I'll be fine then. After that, let's try and make this as much of a conversation as possible so that I don't get lonely here. Yeah? Please. Thank you. It's kind of difficult to know what poem to begin a reading with. And I had a hunch about which poem I would start with today. And it so happens that's the page I've opened to, so it must be the right decision. This is a poem addressed to my friends. And it's a tribute to my friends, though it may not sound like one. I was talking to someone the other day, and she said that she knows that her relationships have reached some state of intimacy when she finds herself feeling maternal about the other person. And I was thinking about that, and I realized that for me, I kind of know whether a relationship is here to stay when I start experiencing the other, even for just a moment, as a friend. Whether it's a colleague, whether it's a relative, as soon as I can tell myself I'm in the presence of a friend, it feels like something's right. This is to my friends, and they're a challenging bunch of people, so it's an affectionate tribute, but perhaps may not seem that way right at first glance. And I have no doubt that my friends are fully capable of addressing me in a pretty similar fashion. I'm a challenging friend to have as well. My friends, they're Sodom, the lot of them. Leafy, with more than a whiff of damage. Mottled with history, dark with grime. God knows I'd wanted them different. Less preoccupied, more jaunty, less handled with care, more airbrushed, less prone to impossible dreams, less perishable, a little more willing to soak in the sun. They don't measure up. They're unpunctual. They turn suddenly tuberous. But they matter for their crooked smiles, their endless distractions, their sudden pauses, signs that they know how green stems twist and thicken as they vanish into the dark, making their own way through sticky, vernacular tissues of mud, improvising, blundering, improvising. Is this mic all right? Can you hear me clearly? Can you? Yeah? Okay. I was trying to explain to someone the notion of an Ishtadeta. And I was trying to tell him, this is an Italian friend, I was trying to explain to him how we live in a culture that has, on the one hand, this highly sophisticated philosophical tradition of non-dualism, and on the other hand, we have this whole vibrant, messy pantheon of gods and goddesses to choose from. Kind of spiritual a la carte, I was telling him. And when I found I wasn't really able to explain, I decided to write a poem. So this is my poem about Ishtadevatas, which surely is, to my mind, one of the most wonderful things about living in the culture that we do. How some Hindus find their personal gods. For A.S., who wonders about Ishtadevatas. It's about learning to trust the tug that draws you to some shadowed alcove, undisturbed by footfall or butter lamps. A blue dark coolness where you find him waiting patiently. That perfect minor deity, shy, crumbly, oven fresh, just a little wry, content to play a cameo in everyone's life but your own. A God who looks like he could understand errors in translation, blizzards on the screen, gaps in memory, lapses in attention. Who looks like he might learn by rote the fury, the wheeze, the pali, the pigeon, the gnashing mixer grinder, the awkward Remington stutter of your heart. Who could make them his own. After that, you can settle for none other. One of the things that interests me is the fact that poets increasingly seem to be called upon to, well, there seems to be an expectation in the cultural climate that poets will play the role of purveyors of sociology rather than sensuousness. That's the way it sometimes seems to me, that they sometimes are expected to be political in a particular kind of way, which doesn't always seem fair to me. And then I started wondering about all the people who seem to be spokespersons for one cause or the other. And I wondered which constituency would make the mistake of electing me as its representative. And I've decided I've kind of found my tribe. But that's if I find the poem. It's called I Speak for Those with Orange Lunchboxes. I speak for those with orange lunchboxes who play third tree in an orchard of 8 in the annual school play, who aren't head girls, games captains, class monitors, who watch other girls fight for the seesaw from the far wall across the sandpit, who remember everyone's lines but their own, who pelt after the school bus, their mother's breakfast still lurching in their gut. Those with orange lunchboxes. I speak for them. Someone earlier today was talking about a poem called Sharecropping, which is actually in the first section of the book that to my mind belongs to another book altogether, but it happens to be in the first section of this book. It appeared in the UK edition of my earlier book, which was called Where I Live. But since it is part of this book, it feels right to read it here. I have a whole section, a whole selection of family poems in my various books, starting with my very first one, which had a poem to my grandmother, my sister, and somewhere along the way it felt like it was time to write a poem to my mother, Sharecropping. I'm wearing my mother's sari, her blood group, her osteoarthritic knee. We voted for different men, same governments. In dreams, she plays among trees of rubber and beetle palm outside a home in Myanmar, while I scamper down dark service stairways in Bombay buildings, sharp with the smell of urine and kesar agarbatti, smoking out of the breast pocket of the 7th floor madman. She lusted after Devanand, I after Imran Khan. On television, both still sport headfuls of black hair. She treads nimbly across language. I bowl every now and then into mouldering inertias. I come undone with muzak, or a compliment. My mother's made of sterner stuff. Sowing the same dream in a different self. The cussed logic we both know behind eons of parenting. We talk Buddhism, Lata Mangeshkar, plot pedicures late into the night, and she watches me. Ancient peasant, canny harvester, her eyes bright with defeat as I grow stealthily into her body. Here it is then, the treachery of middle age, of love. It gets no closer than this, Mum. I'm moving into the Shakuntala poems. I do intend to read them and more. But before that, a lighter poem. It's a poem called Banaras, and I'm tempted to read it because I see Arshia here, who was part of a very significant trip that we made to Banaras in the year 2009. Banaras. And it has an epigraph that goes, Moonlight English Coaching Center, O label to standard label. Sign on Kedar Ghat, August 2009. Label 1. There shall be no collisions as long as every cow sports 5 heads, 12 legs, 8 wheels, 10 bicycle bells, and 1 moon. Label 2. This Pandit with the cheddar cheese voice has scratched his tummy as long as that dog has dreamt of transmigration. Label 3. No board exams here. The living are coached on dying, the dead on rebirthing, the priests on parody. Manikarnika blazes in an endless semi-final. Label 4. Pizza Hut is just 1,000 years old. Label 5. Each time he spits, he unleashes a torrent of juice, snot, stomach enzymes, and a Veda. Incredible India, you say. The universe in a globule of pan, profligate with mucus and metaphysics, sparing only with our semen. Label 6. Paul arrives from Kerala with brandy, returns with Gangajal. His sadhu friend and guide is ex-Naxalite. Label 7. Manya calls. She asks where I am. I am blank. Before me, the hotel wallpaper, a palm-fringed sea, has turned grey with the effluence of those that have lain here before me, contemplating death and room service. That evening, label 8. We hunt, we thirst, we ache, desperate pilgrims, fevered seekers, for just 1 millimeter of riverbank that we can call God-forsaken. I'm trying to find a way to ease into the Shakuntala poems that for me are the challenging ones to read on one level, but I feel I must read them simply because I knew that this book was kind of done when the Shakuntala poems were complete. That's when I knew I had a book on my hands. So they are in fact the spine of the book, and I'm glad you picked that up. It was very much, they are for me central to the book. The thing is to find a way to introduce them. And I don't want to say too much, but I do want to say this. It was the year 2003, and I remember being in this hotel room in Guwahati, contemplating death in room service, no doubt. But no, I was in this hotel room looking up at the ceiling and suddenly found myself thinking of the Shakuntala story, which I don't have to repeat here. It's a story we're all familiar with. We have a sense of it from the Kalidasa version as well as the Mahabharata. But it was the image of Shakuntala leaving the forest, which is very poignant in the Kalidasa play. She bids goodbye to her foster father, to Kanva Maharshi, to the fawn that is her friend, to her two friends, Priyambada and Anasuya. And I remember for some reason thinking, why on earth would this woman, who seemed to have access to this complete a life, why would she leave the forest? And I think this is something that almost every reader feels when you come across that section, because you already know, of course, that this is going to be it's a bad move. She's going to the wrong place, to the wrong person. You know that even as you read it. That happened in 2003. And in 2010, when I found that Shakuntala was still with me, I decided I had to sit down and make my peace with her in some way. And that's how the poems happened. The starting image is that of a woman who is, whom I suspect would be unhappy if she had continued living in the forest. She'd have yearned or wondered about life in the court. And if she had, in fact, continued to live in court, I suspect she'd have wanted to get back to that forest. And I said, this is because she's the daughter of a rishi and the daughter of an apsara. That's a recipe for disaster. Obviously, she's conflicted, she's split. And then I started writing the poems. And by the end of the poems, something shifted. And I no longer saw her as a disaster. And this would never have happened if I hadn't written them. For me personally, that shift would not have happened. By the end of the poems, I was able to see her as a person with a tremendous vantage point, with a tremendous capacity for multiple citizenship, in a sense. And that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't written these. They're just poems as I see them about all the stories that we know in world myths and sacred literature about journeys from innocence to experience, worked out in one way or the other. 8 poems for Shakuntala. I won't read all, I'll read a few. 1. So here you are, just another mixed up kid, daughter of a sage and celestial sex worker. Clueless, like the rest of us, about your address, hermitage or castle, earth or sky, here or hereafter. What did you expect? What could you be but halfway, forever, interim? What else but goddamn human? 2. The trick, Shakuntala, is not to see it as betrayal when the sky collapses and closes in as 4 windowless walls, with perhaps a chipped Mickey Mouse magnet on the refrigerator door, or as eviction when the ceiling crumbles and you walk into a night of stars. 3. Yes, there's the grizzled sage, Kanva, his clarity that creeps into your bones like warmth on a winter evening. As you watch the milky jade of the river Malini flow by, serene, annotated by cloud. And there's a home that will live forever in the folklore of tourist brochures detonating with butterflies. But what of those nights when all you want is a lover's breath? Regular, regular. Starlight through a diaphanous curtain, and a respite from too much wisdom. 4. Besides, who hasn't known Dushyanta's charms? The smell of perspiration, the sour, sharp beginnings of decay that never quite leave a man who's breathed the air of courtrooms and battlefields. A man with wine-dark eyes, who knows of the velvet liquors and hushed laughter in curtained recesses. A man whose smile is abstraction and crow's feet, whose gaze is just a little shop-soiled, whose hair, mussed by summer winds, still crackles with the verbal joust of distant worlds. Who hasn't known a man cinnamon-tongued, stubbled with desire, and just the right smear of history? 5. The same hackneyed script, the same old cast, springtime and the endless dress rehearsal. A woman, last aside, a deer, 2 friends, the lotus, the bee, the inevitable man, the heart's sudden, and a pest. Nothing original, but the hope of something new between parted lips. A kiss, jasmine, lapis, moonshock, and around the corner with the old refrain, this chorus, Sanskrit, Greek, whatever. It's never close enough. It's never long enough. It's never enough. It's never. I'm going to skip a couple of poems and move on to the last one. I just feel I should do the last one because it's in the last 2 poems that Shakuntala takes on her own voice. Until this time, I felt I've been hurling poems at her and felt like she needed to speak as well. This is Shakuntala reflecting on the kind of conclusion she would like for herself, the way she would like her story to end. 8. And what you might say of the ending. And Shakuntala speaks. Yes, it's cozy, family album in place, a kid with a name to bequeath to a country, perhaps even a chipped magnet on the refrigerator door. I'm in favor of happy endings too, but not those born of bad bargains. Next time, let there be a hermitage in coconut green light. The sage and I in conversation. 2 friends at the door, weaving garlands of fragrant dream through days long and riverine, and gazing at a waterfront stunned by sun, my mother on an indefinite sabbatical from the skies. And let me never take for granted this green into which I was born. This green without ache, this green without guile, stippled with bird call, bruised with sun. This clotted green, this unpremeditated green. And as wild jasmine blooms in courtrooms and lotuses in battlefields, let warriors with wine-dark eyes and hair rinsed in summer wind gamble forever with noble-kneed fawns in the ancient forests of memory. Okay, I think it'll be time soon to just stop and maybe open this to a conversation. But before that, I think I must read the title poem. In some ways, it feels wrong to even come to a provisional end of an evening without the title poem. So, When God is a Traveler. I was talking earlier about journeys, and this is a story that I think we all know. But let me just sort of refresh our memories for those of us who tucked it away somewhere, as I had. Shiva, one day, held out, you remember, the fruit of knowledge to his two sons. And he says, the one who runs the race, who travels the entire world and returns first, gets the fruit. So there's a race there. And Kartikeya, or Muruga, or Subramania, or Skanda, as he's called, jumps onto his peacock and takes off for this journey around the world. And Ganesha, or Ganapati, who's a little less literal, perhaps a little less agile, decides to just circle his parents. So he circles Shiva and Parvati and returns and claims the fruit. And of course, the parents are delighted. And it seems a bit like kind of maskala going. But if your parents are Shiva and Shakti, it probably means that Ganapati was wiser than many of us. And Kartikeya returns, some years later probably. And I imagine him walking in and just being aghast at the sight of Ganapati sitting with his trunk stained with fruit juice and sitting cozily on his parents' lap. And he flies into a rage. And that's when Shiva tells him, supposedly, and there's a lovely Tamil film song to that effect, but you are the fruit. Why on earth did you have to look for it anywhere else? And I often wonder, would Kartikeya have been able to hear that before he set out on his journey? I suspect he wouldn't have. And that's how the poem happened. When God is a traveler, wondering about Kartikeya, Muruga, Subramania, my namesake. Trust the God back from his travels, his voice whole grain and chamomile, his wisdom neem, his peacock sweaty plumed, drowsing in the shadows. Trust him who sits wordless on park benches, listening to the distant cries of children fading into the dusk, his gaze emptied of vagrancy, his heart of ownership. Trust him who has seen enough. Revolutions, promises, the desperate light of shopping malls, hospital rooms, manifestos, theologies, the great craters in the middle of love. Trust him who no longer begrudges his brother his prize, his parents their partisanship. Trust him whose race is run, whose journey remains, who stands fluid-stemmed, knowing he is the tree that bears fruit, festive with sun. Trust him who recognizes you, auspicious, abundant, battle-scarred, alive, and knows from where you come. Trust the God, ready to circle the world all over again, this time for no reason at all other than to see it through your eyes. I think we can pause here and maybe even conclude here, but if there are questions, responses, We can take our time over them. They don't have to be forced. And I'm happy with long pauses, so that's fine too.
Hi, I'm Ankush. I have not gone through your latest collection, but there's some of your poetry which I had been reading online before. One thing which struck me, and I would want you to shed a bit of light on this, is I decidedly saw there was a marked, spiritual dimension to your poetry, despite or in spite of them being very grounded in reality. I mean, none of it seemed incomprehensible or abstract, and yet generally the way your poems end, there is a spiritual solace almost in most of the poems. I mean, that is how I sort of read it. Would you please comment on it? I had one more question.
Make my life easier, tell me. Huh?
Okay, there's one thing which struck me, and this has been one of my preoccupations since long. I think one of your poems, Another Way, it really got me thinking about a question. Your poem, it ends like this. It says, this was also a way of keeping the faith. It has always, wondered whether the existence of a god, man-made or otherwise, is necessary for keeping faith, in the broadest sense of the term.
Ankush, to move back from your second question to the first,
Yes.
I just want to say one thing, just as a quick clarification, that even the gods in this book, and as you can see there are many,
Yes.
they're there as archetypal figures in a way. That's how they appear in the book. The connect with Shakuntala, that's how it happened. I saw her as an almost explosive archetype. And for me, those are really tributes to the power of myth, and the ways in which myth can come into your life, creep up on you when you least expect it, and disrupt your life, as it did for me. But to come to your first question, I think this is the way I often answer it. So I'm going to use an earlier ruse that I developed to answer this question, which is that I feel that there was a time in my life when my life seemed derailed by what I like to call one of the blank spaces on a page of poetry. It took me a long time to realize that all those blank spaces on a page of poetry meant something. For many years, I practiced poetry, not quite realizing how dark an art it is. Not realizing how it can, not realizing really the demands that it makes on you. To understand it in terms of word, but also in terms of pause. And when I got swallowed up by a pause, in a manner of speaking, I think I grew much more respectful of my understanding of those silences, those blank spaces on a page of poetry. And if there's one thing that's changed, though I think the preoccupation with quest has been there from the very first book, if I think there's something that has changed, it feels like the poetry itself is less, when I see it on the page, it seems to be less of a dense verbal unit. There seems to my mind to be more, it breathes differently. It's a more porous entity now, as I see it. So perhaps for that reason, porosity has become a kind of recurrent image. I actually have a poem on osteoporosis. I have references to an osteoporotic knee. But definitely the preoccupation with holes,
Yes.
with craters, has grown. And sometimes those holes are a source of fear. And at other times there has been a recognition of the fact that those holes are the source of the poem's octane. That's where its energy comes from as well.
I'm going to try to ask a question. It's going to be incoherent because I'm trying to
That's
think.
the way I like it. I'm more comfortable that way.
There's something about the way you are writing which brings, in which I feel something very old and something very contemporary is converging. And it's converging in a way that is contemporary. As I said, I'm going to be incoherent because I'm not even sure. I'm just trying to ask you whether this is a dance of which you are aware. When I hear you, and when I think about the Bhakti tradition, for example, I feel that you are doing something very particular within, but also without it. There's a way in which your work is coming from a very old place, but it's going somewhere very new and very fresh. You may not even recognize your writing in these terms, but could you just respond to my incoherence?
Okay, I'm going to respond incoherently. One of the things we discussed at the workshop even earlier today was the way in which the old and the new, we were talking about this, weren't we, in terms of images. One is on the level of pure juxtaposition, which makes it sound like a very mechanical act, which is just juxtaposing old images with the new. If I felt it was happening purely on that level, I wouldn't trust it. And I'm aware of when that happens. I wouldn't trust it. I wouldn't allow myself to keep a poem that comes out of that place of habit, or that place of glibness. But the anthology of Bhakti poetry is coincidentally, or perhaps not so coincidentally, out at the same time. It's available right now, and it's something I've been working on for the past 4 years. But it's been an area of preoccupation well before that. And let me see if I can answer your question coming in from there, Lata, which is, there was a time when I recognized Bhakti not just as a matter of what Ankush was calling earlier, kind of sitting around doing satsang in a kind of, lots of a gaggle. This is my earlier, somewhat snobbish perception of bhaktas, a sort of gaggle of people sitting around, looking dewy-eyed, weak in the knees, in a way that I could never quite enter or access. I think my understanding of bhakti has changed substantially, and that fueled the Bhakti project independently, but it has certainly leaked into these poems in one way or the other. And for one, it's changed on many levels, but the one thing that I would like to share is the realization of just how visceral devotion is, just how much of the body it is, how and I'm not using these as words, though they've been used before, but just how carnal it is as well, how physical, how unnerving, how disconcerting. Seeing it as a kind of very deep lust as well, that's also been part of it. So it helped me to meet my guru, who finally, I remember, put this in perspective for me when he said, it's absolutely about that. It's about lust for life and a deeper life. And that made immediate sense to me. In some ways, I think that's part of the poems as well, where images that are very sensual, especially in the first part of the book, Black Estrus and so on. Many of the images are extremely sensual. They can work, I think, as one kind of love poem on one level. And of course they are love poems. But I think there is other stuff happening in them too. And I'm uncomfortable with just labeling them one kind of love or the other, but it is about this whole great, messy, emotional landscape that we inhabit, this dangerous, risky place, which is the heart.
I have a request which I have told you I would want you to read with it. And I have a question also on the same. It's one of the first poems I had come across, which you have written. Few points I think maybe you have covered in the last question, but still. It's very interesting. You presented, as you said, finding yearning Naika, starting with. And towards the end, there is a sudden twist, which is never expected, the kind of pace at which you have started. And so is it a kind of, you want to actually liberate the so traditional, conventional Naika, which is rich in almost all our ancient poetry and any other art forms, such as music, dance, wherever we celebrate. So you want to paint a different picture? Was it a conscious decision to liberate the Naika, which you've been seeing, listening, just want to understand? How did you, where the impetus come from to end the poem in a sudden twist, which was, I was taken aback. And I find it very fascinating, or I want to go back, read and that always attracts me. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. He's talking about a particular poem called Vigil, which is a poem from our very first book. And eventually that poem became the basis of a collaboration between Aladme Valley, the dancer, and me. We did a collaboration that was called Only Until the Light Fades, which used this particular poem. And it interested me really that she chose this poem to work on, because the origins of this poem, in a sense for me, was dance. That's where it all started. I grew up watching Bharatanatyam, practicing it to some degree, but watching a great deal of it. And I remember feeling this simultaneous fascination, with the beauty, the costumes, the jewelry, beauty of that whole form, the symmetry, the grandeur of the form. A fascination with that, as well as a distaste and a recoil from what you call the endlessly pining Naika, who seemed to do nothing but pine for men who were always unpunctual and unfaithful. And that seemed to be all that they were about. And there were lots of dancers freely bandying about words like Jivatma and Paramatma. And it just felt like those words were being used easily in a kind of trite and horrible fashion. So I felt very uncomfortable with that kind of thing. And I think the poem was actually born from that simultaneous sense of fascination and recoil. That's where the poem happened. And I was delighted when Vali chose that poem, because it happened because of dance for me, and it went back to dance through her. And yeah, does that answer your question? It is about an ambivalence. That poem is about an ambivalence. So there is irony in the poem, and there's also some amount of lyricism in the poem, and the two go together, sometimes uneasily, but they're always sort of side by side. They're always alongside each other, I think.
You're making a very strong point towards the end. So it was a very conscious.
Someone told me that end should not, someone said, couldn't you have allowed for just a little more lyricism and let it go? And instead I pulled back at the end, don't I? Maybe I'd have done it differently today. I don't know. Maybe I would. Do you want me to read that?
Yes.
It's a poem from the first book, so it may sound a little different from some of these, but maybe not, I don't know. Vigil. As shadows lengthen, as the horizon smudges into secrecy, as the ocean withdraws into a misty November opacity, feelings begin to grow more medieval. And I long for you, as other lovers have before me, in a great melodic deluge awash through history, veined silver with melancholy, deep-throated, brine-flecked with yearning. Twilight is the light for lyric poetry, a stab of blue kingfisher poetry, a small blaze of longing and regret that is almost love, too slight for immortality, too intense to go unsung. I almost understand now why those women, in the poems I've ritually deplored, wandered over to their mirrors, tracing against their lips the wine stain of an unforgotten passion, coiling against their necks, seething torrents of hair into a muted tempest, still electric with desire. And it feels like I too could wait for you while I perform the erotic liturgies of another world. Wait for you who understands like none other the prosody of my breath. Wait for you, and you alone. But only until the light fades, my love. Only until the light fades.
Okay, regarding the poem God is a Traveler, okay, it just got me thinking how easy or difficult it is to reinvent mythological characters vis-a-vis mythological constructs and sort of infuse them with a fresh moral perspective. Because I mean, I would not, I mean, it is a fresh perspective.
No, Ankush, no, it's a good question. Gosh, these are the workshop students who are giving me a hard time. I need someone else now also to respond. But Ankush, to answer the question, it's a good question. Perhaps I would not allow myself, or in the past, I would not have allowed myself more than a passing reference to certain mythic figures. That's how it's been in the earlier poems. There are always mythic figures, but they're references.
Yes.
I don't know, it's with this book that there's been a whole cycle of Shakuntala poems.
Yes.
There's been this poem to Kartikeya. I don't know why that happened, but for many years, actually from 97 onwards, here's a confession. I decided to actually stay away from narrative in a particular way. I decided to stay away from novels, for instance, because I felt I wanted to be with poetry and I wanted to be with a certain kind of more sacred literature, but I didn't want to read novels. It felt like they were too seductive, too beguiling in a way that I didn't want right now in my life. But the more I stayed away from narrative, the more I found earlier narratives, which were part of my bloodstream like they are for all of us, I found some of them resurfacing and suddenly disrupting the fabric of my life. And I think both these Shakuntala poems and the Kartikeya poems were born of those disruptions. So because those, I suddenly realized what myth and archetype can mean, I think, through them. Yeah.
Question there.
I don't know if this is on. Anyway, can you hear me? Yeah. I found it very interesting to listen to little glimpses about your formal practice in the answers to the other questions. And I thought since this area has not been covered in the discussion, I should lead into it for all of our benefit, especially as you've got a few decades of writing behind you and you can look back on it at those technical details. When you were reading, I could see how the narrative is tight and the description adds the texture as you go along. Very interestingly, I was not able to visualize the line breaks and I really loved that. I totally loved it, that there are clusters of words and the attention is going cluster by cluster by cluster and you're leading into the narrative. In the very last poem you read, however, it was entirely different. The pauses and the pace was different. The pace of that vigil and the pace of the other poems, there seems to be some difference. And you talked a little bit about how you breathe differently now. I wonder if you have noticed in your own work a difference in pace. For me right now, this is a very fascinating question. The pace of thought and the pace of words. And how we negotiate between the two of them, and as we change ourselves, how the tempo changes. When you read, however, even if you're reading poems that have slightly different technique, you're still reading them in the same way. You're presenting them like in a dancer style, very simple. So I'd love to have your insight, if you could share any on your reflections, your own speed, etc.
Did you say that one was reading them in the same way, but on the other hand, when you heard the last poem I just read, it was different?
Yes.
It's certain. I think it must be different because it was a poem written a long time ago, and in the very first book, and I think a lot has changed since then. It's also probable that I will read most poems differently now. That's also a possibility, but if that didn't happen, then I'm inclined to say the reason for that is because that was the first book and this is the fourth. And the closest I can come to it, Mani, is for me to see it as poems with I'm much more conscious of the holes in my poems. That's what I can say, which is the most honest way for me to say it right now. Otherwise I'm going to sound pretentious. I'm much more aware of all those gaping spaces on a page of poetry. It's not a full answer to your question, but it's the truest for now.
Arundhathi, it's always such a pleasure to hear you read for so many reasons, but and among my favorites of your poems, and I've heard you read now for many years, are the funny ones. The lunchbox one, that Mrs. Gulden, the needlework, and the shoes.
They're all here.
Yeah.
I should have done them. I decided I was too solemn today.
I think so, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's such an attractive part of your voice. Because they're not like Ogden Nash funny, but
No.
they're so finely observed and they're so self-deprecating. And I know that laconic is a word that's used very often to describe the way you write, but I just find them just bursting with joy and humor. So my question really is it harder for you to write a poem? Are you a somber person? Are you, is it harder for you to write I don't know what to call it, funny poem? That's a silly word. But you know the poems I'm talking about.
No, I do. See, there was also a decision I took, and I'm taking now, and I need a little pat on the back for that decision. It was not an easy one to make. Which is, at readings, it's the easiest thing in the world to pick out the funny poems. And it's the easy one to do. So I've done that. I know how to pepper, 3 solemn poems and 1 quickie. I know how to do that, but I chose not to today and for a few of these readings because there is a particular kind of mood that for me is central to the Shakuntala poems, and all I'm doing in a sense is leading up to them and away from them. I hope some of you will go home with the book and find some of the lighter ones in there, but I'm happy to read one if you want me to. I thought Banaras was reasonably somber. It was not somber.
No, it was very fun.
I should read it faster.
No, I was just wondering what different headspace you need to occupy when you write them, rather than when you present them. I can see how this evening is a somber evening, but
Vibrant.
Yes, it is it's silence full of possibility.
Pauses, darling, pauses.
Pauses. All right, I'll read. The thing I wanted to say though is that I could pick out. There's an old one that usually is a fun one to do, but I don't have it with me, and there's no one here with my first book. Or I might have done advice to a 4-year-old on her first day of school. I'm happy to do those, but.
Something else you would remember you would have written very early.
No, it's not that I turned from light to somber. Okay, let me say this. Let me read a couple of other poems in the book. I think the important thing is tonal variation, and I feel the tonal variations happened, like to believe, even in what I read to you. So I hope that for me, they are not somber poems as much as they are poems that are, okay, it's awful to have to describe your own poetry, so I'm going to stop. Okay. But they were not intended to be somber. What do you want, Miss Gazda?
Yeah, I love that. Also like the shoes and...
Should I do wearing high heels?
Yeah, that's all right.
Okay, wearing high heels is about, and it's in this book, so you know that it belongs here too. It's about heels, wearing high heels. And the fact that sometimes there are moments in your life when you look back, you realize that a particular object takes on a certain charge. And I realized looking back that that pair of high heels was significant for all these reasons. Wearing high heels. It was those heels that I wore to the Class 8 jam session. They left red wheels on my feet as I stumbled across the dusty J.B. Pettit school hall. But that night, the weedy boys from the school next door turned into something else. Lithe warriors, medieval, almost epic, dark, Deccan, gait honed by a wisdom as old as Patanjali, with just a frisson of Travolta. Their conversations fluent as streams that burble by motionless sages in forest hermitages, their senses alert to jungle breath and portents of sky and recondite shifts of woman weather. I have grown too tall for heels. The boys have grown into bankers and soft-bellied intellectuals. But when lights dim and city drawing rooms turn vertiginous, I see them all over again. Dark, feral, lean-haunched, shadowy, shape whittled down to what really counts. Men. Where is Arshia?
Yeah,
Is that all right?
Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. I'm trying to pick out another, but I'm not going to do that. I think it's the whole. The evening for me has to hold together in a particular way. Wearing high heels belongs, but so do the others. Yeah. Yes.
It's sort of like a fallback to Ankush's question about engaging with mythology when you write. When you choose a subject, like say the Kartika poem or Shakuntala, or when you start writing it, do you start with a position or a perspective in mind? Because like I said, we've all heard these stories growing up, and inevitably when we read them, there's always a perspective or a certain position towards a character or towards the story itself that we take.
Yeah.
So when you begin to write a poem like that, do you write with that perspective in mind, or to articulate a certain position, or does it take its own course as you write? Because like with Shakuntala, you said the shift happened, and I'm assuming that shift happened because it was a series of poems and not a standalone.
Yes.
But does it work like that even if it is a standalone poem?
It's a good question. I think it certainly happened with the Kartikeya poems. The insight that this journey had to be made by this god. He had to make that journey. Even if it is a long, unnecessary journey, seemingly, he has to make it. That insight perhaps fueled the poem, but there are certain things that happened in the course of writing that took me by surprise, which is how it is for everyone who writes, I think. That you discover moments when suddenly you said, oh my God, this is also what is uncovered when you explore this journey or this person, this figure. And those are the rewards of writing, you know, those discoveries where you thought you knew why you were doing it and you've suddenly landed somewhere else. That's the joy of it too. Yeah.
May I ask one question?
Yes.
You have been inspired by so many legends from our scriptures. Did not Mahabharata inspire you to did you write any poem from that character?
Shakuntala is, the story of Shakuntala is in the Mahabharata.
There are so many other characters which are more prominent.
Maybe that will happen. Maybe that will. As I said, these were characters who crept up on me when I didn't quite expect them to. So maybe there will be others that will. I'm going to read a poem for Arshia because I know I'm a bit concerned that she will go away from this evening believing that we talked only about gods. So this is a Bombay poem for all those who also want a flavor of another kind of work that I used to do and continue to do. It's part of, city poems are an integral part of this book as well. But I'd like to do Where I Live, which is a Bombay poem for many of us here, and I see more than one who had a Bombay connection. So this is for them. Where I Live. For Anders who wants to know. I live on a wedge of land, reclaimed from a tired ocean, somewhere at the edge of the universe. Greetings from this city of L'Oreal sunsets and diesel afternoons, deciduous with concrete, botoxed with vanity. City of septic magenta hair clips, of garrulous sewers and tight-lipped taps, of 80s film tunes buzzing near the left temple, of ranting TV soaps and monsoon melodramas. City racked by hope and bulimia. City uncontained by movie screen and epigram. City condemned to unspool in an eternal hysteria of lurid nylon dream. City where you can drop off a swollen local and never be noticed. City where you're a part of every imli soaked bhelpuri. City of the Mahalakshmi beggar peering up through a gorse bush of splayed limbs. City of dark alleys. City of mistrust. City of forsaken tubelit rooms. City that coats the lungs, stiffens the spine, chills the gut with memory. City suspended between flesh and mortar and faux leather and delirium, where it is perfectly historical to be looking out on a sooty handkerchief of ocean, searching for God. Back to God. I know it's been a long evening and you should start thinking of heading home, so may I just read the last poem of the book because it feels appropriate to read a poem that's called Poems Matter, that being the title of this session. Unless there's anyone else who'd like to say or ask anything. Okay. As I see it, these are two companion poems. The one marks the beginning of the section and the other marks the end. The first is a poem called Textile. And all I want to say about these two poems is that I suddenly realized that the first poem and the last poem in the book return to the image of fabric, fabric with holes. So it feels right to end the evening that way. Someone asked me this, Arshia, incidentally, in Delhi, ending with the notion of tattered fabric. Isn't that a somewhat gloomy way to end? And my answer to that, actually, in the context of this book, at any rate, is no. You know, fabrics do get worn, and there are holes. That happens. That happens. Textile. Some days, nothing in your wardrobe satisfies. Not the heat-maddened ikkats, not the secular pastels. There's no season you can call your own. Like others, you wait in queues for the drought to end. Although you know everything there is to know about the guile and the gristle of the heart, its handloom desires, its spandex fantasies, its polycot, its wear and tear polytheism. And you know that when it finally happens, the whoosh of textile, versatile, block printed by sun, it will feel big enough to put an end to all the throbbing questions forever. But the winters, they get colder each time. And so you return, reluctantly, to digging through the stretch and seam and protest of tattered muscle, deeper into the world's oldest fabric, deeper into the darkening, widening meritocracy of the heart. And the last poem, Poems Matter. It was snobbery, perhaps, or habit, to want perforation. To choose cotton, for instance, with its coarse asymmetries, over polyester or unctuous rayon. But this, I suppose, is what we were looking for all along. This weave that dares to embrace air, this hush of linen, these frayed edges, these places where thought runs threadbare, where colors bleed into something vastly blue, like sky. These tatters, at peace almost with the great outrage of not being around. It's taken a long time to understand. Poems matter because they have holes.
Thank you, Arundhathi. I'm sure all of you found it as arresting as I did. Thank you for doing this for TFA and for the British Council Library. One last round of applause for I just wanted to say that that's the last event for this calendar year by Toto Funds the Arts, and the next event is going to be the Toto Awards on January the 10th at the Anios, so please try and be there, all those who are interested in it. Thank you again, Arundhathi.
Thank you, Anmol. Thank you, TFA. Thank you, the British Council. But very specially, thank you, Sarita. Thank you, Anmol, for warmth, for hospitality, for making one feel that poems and poets matter.